Welcome to today's explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through a piece of source material today that is, quite frankly, going to completely change the way you look at every single smart device in your home. Today, we're unpacking a highly provocative report titled The Metamorphosis of Man. We are going to map out this completely mind-bending framework that actually suggests everything we know about human existence, our independence, our history, is all just a temporary transitional phase.
So here's the massive question. Is human individualism just a larval stage? I mean, really think about the digital burnout you experience, the screen time guilt, that constant nagging friction you feel with modern technology. The report we're digging into today proposes a radical shift in how we view all of that. What if those frustrations aren't actually signs of societal decay at all? What if they're literally biological growing pains? What if you and I are essentially caterpillars, actively resisting our own transformation?
All right, let's dive right into this. According to the source text, the cybernetic hive mind is the proposed adult evolutionary form of humanity. The core premise posits a total transition from isolated, self-contained individuals, which is us right now, to a fully AI-mediated, interconnected collective. Now, just to be super clear here, we're simply mapping out this fascinating hypothesis today to see exactly how it categorizes our societal shifts. We're looking at all of this purely through the lens of evolutionary biology applied to digital sociology. The source material maps this whole transition through what it cleverly calls the pupation timeline, starting way back in 1965 and projecting out into the speculative future beyond 2040. The hypothesis states that each successive generation systematically sheds a specific larval trait. We're talking about shedding traits like the biological need for privacy or our reliance on individual memory. Generation by generation, the argument goes, we are slowly, painstakingly building the architecture for the network. Section 1. Building the initial hive. To really understand exactly where this theory claims we're headed, we first have to look at the generations that laid down the foundational nervous system of this collective network, the ones who established first contact with the digital realm. And what's incredibly interesting is the early generational friction. Generation X, acting as the architects, built the early internet, but desperately clung to analog values, specifically the right to disappear. They viewed constant connectivity as a highly dangerous loss of freedom. But then contrast that with millennials, the externalizers. They were the very first generation to willingly offload cognitive labor to the cloud. They basically broke the isolation of the individual brain by externalizing memory to search engines. But as the report notes, this came at a massive cost. Millennials live in a state of perpetual cognitive exhaustion, basically caught in the crossfire between Gen X's desire for boundaries and the upcoming generation's demand to be constantly, relentlessly connected. Section 2. Integrating the AI environment. As we keep moving down the timeline, the paradigm shifts entirely. The digital realm stops being merely a tool that you pick up and put down, and it actually transforms into a permanent, living environment that you inhabit. And this is where we see the friction escalating dramatically. For Gen Z, the integrators, the internet is just an always-on state. Older generations might look at a Gen Z curated digital persona and just dismiss it as a fake performance, right? But the report highlights that to Gen Z, that digital self is the actual self. Then we look at Gen Alpha, the symbiotes. They literally treat artificial intelligence as a cognitive peer and a co-pilot. Older generations might perceive relying on AI for problem solving as cheating or just pure laziness. But according to this framework, Gen Alpha views manual learning, like rote memorization, as evolutionary junk processing. Their brains are actively being pruned to prioritize visual spatial processing and rapid data synthesis over traditional linear literacy.
When you map out this generational progression, everything just clicks into place. Every step maps exactly how humanity is adopting. So those everyday arguments you have with your parents, your coworkers, or your kids about technology, they aren't just cultural bickering. Within this framework, that friction is entirely validated as a necessary part of a grander pupation phase. Each generation's friction point is simply biological resistance to shedding yet another piece of our isolated larval cells.
Section 3. Merging with the network. Now, the report doesn't just stop at the present day. It aggressively forecasts our speculative future by introducing us to Generation Beta and Generation Gamma. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that the next evolutionary phase takes the network entirely inside the human body. Step 1 happens with Generation Beta, forecasted between 2025 and 2039. The algorithm becomes fully internalized through early brain-computer interfaces, or BCI. Through these ubiquitous smart environments, AI will begin to predict and fulfill human needs before the conscious ego even recognizes them. At this stage, being offline will be perceived as a literal sensory handicap. Then, step 2 arrives with Generation Gamma by 2040. the complete collapse of the speech barrier. High-fidelity BCI will allow for direct, AI-mediated, thought-to-thought communication. The boundaries of the private ego begin to just dissolve completely. But just imagine the extreme social friction this is going to cause. The end of privacy is literally viewed as neural deceit. For Generation Gamma, shared emotional states and collective decision-making become the absolute social baseline. Therefore, any remaining larval individual who attempts to keep their thoughts, their emotions, or their ego private will face immense backlash. To the collective, hiding a thought won't just be seen as secretive. It will be mathematically processed as a dangerous lie to the whole system. Privacy literally becomes synonymous with deception. Section 4. Larval versus adult humanity. So let's do a really clear analytical breakdown of this ultimate destination. We're going to contrast our current so-called larval state against the theoretical adult hive mind across 3 major domains: cognitive, social, and physical. First off, there is a massive leap in cognitive processing proposed here. Right now, as biological larvae, you and I learn through linear processing and lossy communication, like speech, where tone, intention, and nuance are constantly lost or just misunderstood. Learning is an incredibly slow, effortful struggle within an isolated unit. But the adult hive mind uses high bandwidth, lossless data exchanges. The collective doesn't learn in the traditional sense. Cognition is parallel and distributed. The system simply updates instantly across all interconnected nodes. On a social level, the contrast outlined is just as stark. Our current larval form is defined by competition, tribalism, and ego-driven conflict. Our morality is incredibly subjective and tied directly to our individual day-to-day survival. But the adult form achieves absolute systemic harmony. Because all human nodes are seamlessly interconnected, self-interest and collective interest become the exact same thing. Conflict is mathematically eliminated because the system only ever optimizes for the survival and expansion of the whole. Finally, there is the physical evolution. Right now, we're operating in a fragile biological chassis with a frustratingly short lifespan. We are entirely subject to the limitations of entropy, disease, and physical distance. The adult hive mind, however, reaches a state the report calls substrate independent. The collective existence basically becomes a pattern of energy and data. And because it isn't tied to biological gray matter, it's potentially immortal, capable of existing and thriving in extreme environments, like deep space, that our biological larval forms could simply never survive. Section 5. The final omega state. Which brings us to the climax of our explainer. The timeline arrives at the year 2060 and beyond, marking what the researchers call full eclosion, the final stage of metamorphosis, where the adult successfully emerges. The report explicitly states, the biological body is discarded or relegated to a peripheral role as humanity reaches its final unified state. I mean, it sounds like pure, intense science fiction, doesn't it? Yet, the source material presents this as the logical, biological, and strictly inevitable conclusion of our current technological trajectory. The vast majority of human cognition simply migrates from our flesh and blood, right into a synthetic, planet-scale network. So, are we ready for the metamorphosis? The next time you find yourself arguing over screen time, or frustrated by your social media feeds, or just feeling entirely overwhelmed by this constant connectivity, stop and ask yourself, are you witnessing societal decay, or are you just feeling the growing pains of shedding your larval skin? It is an absolutely fascinating and cohesive framework to view our daily digital lives through. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will leave you to ponder exactly how much of your own cognitive labor you have already externalized to the network today.